In Chapter 8, Johann Goldsblom explores a particular cluster of technologies, those associated with fire. All human societies control fire, but no other species does. So fire management counts as a species monopoly, a defining feature of our species and our history. The ability to manage fire is also a clear product of cultural accumulation or collective learning. So we can say that the human relationship to fire is unique, universal, and cultural. Though the early history of fire management remains unclear, there is a case for counting it as the first technological threshold in human history. Fire is a form of energy, and like all forms of energy, it can be used to manipulate matter. But to manage fire, you need information. So to understand how humans have managed fire, we need the conceptual triad of energy, matter, and information. Fires need oxygen, so they must have been rare and short-lived before the appearance of an oxygen-rich atmosphere 2 to 3 billion years ago. They also require fuel, which probably means they were rare before the spread of plants on land in the last 400 million years. Finally, fires needed temperatures of high enough heat for ignition, but these can be supplied by many natural forces, including lightning. So our hominin ancestors must surely have been familiar with fire, like all living organisms today. There must have been a long period of increasingly familiarity with fire, which is discussed in recent work by Francis Burton. Then, at some point in the last 2 million years, our ancestors became the first species capable of managing fire, creating it at will, and harnessing it to their own purposes, using accumulating cultural information to do so. The earliest firm dates for controlled use of fire by hominins dates from 250,000 years ago, though some archaeologists have argued that there is good evidence of fire management from Israel and South Africa as early as 800,000 years ago. As the great sociologist Norbert Elias would have insisted, controlling fire also surely meant increasing control by humans over their own behavior. One of these behaviors may have been cooking. Richard Wrangham has argued that fire was critical in human evolution because it allowed our ancestors to cook, in other words, to pre-digest high-value foods such as meat, or foods that were toxic or could not be digested raw. The technology of cooking represented an energy revolution for our ancestors, as it provided high-energy foods in easily digestible forms that used little metabolic energy. A shortening of the human gut with the last 2 million years may be an indirect sign of the importance of cooking and therefore of fire management. Fire also offered an important defensive weapon as well as a focus for increasing sociability. In the form of what is known in Australia as fire stick farming, fire also provided a foretaste of agricultural intensification, as it was used to increase the productivity of the land. Fire played a vital role in the second great technological revolution of human history, that of agrarianization. Farmers increased the production of favored species of plants and animals by rearranging the environments they inhabited. By doing so, they increased the resources and energy available to human beings. Fire was used to clear land in slash and burn farming, so it was responsible for much of the deforestation of the Neolithic era. New and more specialized uses of fire also encouraged an emerging division of labor in occupations from blacksmithing to soldiering. On the other hand, fire brought new forms of danger, especially in towns and cities, whose closely clustered houses and workshops, each with its own fireplaces, provided the fuel and ignition for many a conflagration. Fire was both necessary and terrible. Not surprisingly, it looms large in myths and religions as a godlike force or as a power to be seized and used, as in the Prometheus legend. Fire technologies also drove the third great technological revolution, that of industrialization, which depended on vast new supplies of fuel from coal, oil, and natural gas. Unlike traditional fuels such as wood, which released energy accumulated over just a few decades of photosynthesis, fossil fuels stored energy accumulated over hundreds of millions of years. The subterranean forest of fossil fuels drove new and vastly more powerful technologies of manufacturing and transportation. Concentrated forms of fire also became important as weapons of war. Even most victims of nuclear weapons died from fire. Eventually, electrification allowed the indirect consumption of the energy of fire because the fires that supply electricity do their work far from the point of consumption. That may be why today it is so easy to ignore the role of fire in our lives, and that in turn may explain why today we talk of energy rather than using the more vivid, even animistic images of fire present in most earlier societies. But fire itself is still omnipresent, both as a source of energy and as a source of danger, even if it prefers to work behind the scenes. Eventually, though, if we keep using the energy of fire on today's scales, we may have to acquire it in new forms, perhaps by finding new ways of tapping its energy directly from the largest source of fire in our solar system, the sun. From technologies to social institutions. Chapter 9 by Mary Jo Maines and Ann Waltener discusses the family and household as central themes within world history. They suggest using the concepts of domestication and biopolitics to link family history and global history. Many archaeologists have used the term domestication to refer not just to the Neolithic era, domestication of plants and animals, but also to the self-domestication of humans and the emergence of new forms of family with the cultural invention of human domestic life. Indeed, the Neolithic family and household were vital to human self-domestication. Clive Gamble argues that the earliest Neolithic communities may have been the first to develop fully modern minds and a fully symbolic culture. Such approaches point to a powerful dialectic between the family and the state. They have encouraged research into families as objects of legislation and control, as key structures in the exercise of both political and commercial power, and as managers of labor and compensation for consumption. The notion of biopolitics stresses the importance of political control over human bodies, including attempts to count and measure them, and to regulate fertility and family structures. Michel Foucault famously describes spectacular examples of biopolitical regulation in the modern world, but biopolitics, like domestication, can be traced back at least to the early Neolithic. Of course, family relations of some kind predate the Neolithic, both in the real world and in the world of scholarship. Until the 1970s, the widely accepted notion of man the hunter implied a Paleolithic world of acquisition and production driven by the activities of males and a reproductive world of females shaped by biology rather than by culture. Feminist revisions of these models and new interpretations of the scattered archaeological evidence have highlighted the central role of females in production, the constructed nature even of Paleolithic families and their reproductive behavior, and the importance of households in demographic behavior and in the education and socialization of children. Given the importance of women as gatherers in many foraging societies, it is likely that women played a significant role in the transition to agriculture. Indeed, genetic evidence suggests that marriages between communities of farmers and foragers may have helped spread agricultural technologies and lifeways. Clive Gamble has argued that the Neolithic Revolution transformed patterns of child rearing and socialization, creating entirely new childscapes, new environments that transformed childhood experiences. Ian Hodder was the one who started the approach called the post-processual archaeology to challenge Louis Binford's the new archaeology, or processual archaeology. But anyway, Ian Hodder argues that the family and household were critical agents of socialization. For example, environments such as the Cheikh Bayjal residences of the famous Turkish site of Kaplıhut created childscapes that taught children how society and social networks were organized. Important elements of social organization, cooperative production following a division of labor, settlement building, and kinship rules all emerged without any form of the state. Social complexity here too focused on the local and the household. The households could teach even deeper rules. In Çatalhöyük, internal burials connected to the past to the future through distinct generations, creating a powerful sense of the movement of time. Such structures even carried cosmological information. For example, Egyptian cosmologies tell of gods linked by family ties, within which each god had its own distinctive role within a larger family network. Thus, in one telling, Isis discovered seeds and Osiris taught the Egyptian people how to plant them. The monotheistic religions, for example, offered cosmologies that implied clear gender hierarchies, and it is tempting to associate them with the emergence of new forms of patriarchy. However, religious cosmologies could also seem at odds with family structures, for example, when they idealized celibacy, as Buddhism did in some forms. Families provided idealized templates for states and political structures. Male rulers often represented themselves as members of ancient, descendant lineages through the male line, while Chinese philosophers described a well-ordered state on the analogy of a well-ordered family. The metaphors cut both ways. Likening the power of the king to that of the father neutralized both masculine political power and masculine authority in the household. The result was a sort of naturalization of political power, making its rules and authority seem as self-evident as those of the family. And that perhaps explains why, from the very earliest states, rulers tried to regulate family structures. Fully a third of Hammurabi's law code of the 18th century BCE was concerned with the family. Less metaphorically, family structures often provided the sinews of political power and determined political rights, such as citizenship. Precisely because family structures seemed so self-evident, those who encountered new rules about marriage, kinship, and sexuality often found them peculiarly shocking. Such encounters multiplied from the 16th century. In Southeast Asia, traders from Europe and China were horrified by marriage practices that simplified divorce and allowed women to engage actively and publicly in commerce. Such reactions help explain why colonial rulers such as those of New Spain worked so hard to impose their own ideas and laws about how families should function. On the other hand, slave owners made and remade the family structures of their slaves according to commercial calculations. In these ways, early forms of globalization began to transform kinship structures and ideas in many parts of the world. And as families changed too, so did the metaphors that they provided for the organization of social and political life. Len Hunt showed how, during the French Revolution, the idea of fraternity, or fraternitas, challenged older metaphors of paternal authority. As modern states extended their administrative reach, they began to measure and regulate domestic life in greater detail and with greater success than ever before. Until the 20th century, biopolitics, the routine state surveillance, measurement, and management of human life, became a normal function of governments throughout the world. The most brutal forms of family regulation were associated with colonial regimes, or with the family and racial politics of fascism and the ideas of eugenics. But in more modest forms, the rules of family life, who can marry whom, what the ideal family should look like, and how big it should be, have become routine objects for government regulation, bringing the two domains of government and the family, as well as the two historiographies of politics and the family, ever closer together. Families, it seems, have structured the worlds of every human in every part of the world, in all biomes, since the dispersal of the genus Homo. But they have also structured many aspects of social and political life at larger scales. In Chapter 10, Mary Weissner-Hanks takes up the oldest category of the difference in human history, and that of gender. Gender, like the family, has structured human lives at such a deep level that it must loom large in any serious world history. The category of gender looms large in recent historiography, along with other categories of difference and identity, as the nation has lost its centrality in historical thinking and research. World history as well represents an attempt to find new ways of framing our understanding of the past, but curiously, world history and gender history moved for several decades along parallel paths before eventually intersecting. Most human communities have assumed the existence of dual gender roles. These roles have often been projected symbolically onto the world and the cosmos, as male and female principles, as yin and yang, as private and public. Gender dichotomies have shaped not just the roles of individual men and women, but also how men and women have understood their roles within the family and society. So intimate and persuasive are gender dichotomies that, like the kinship networks in which they are embedded, they have usually been experienced as natural, as intrinsic to the way the world is. Again, male and female, eating and reproducing. This is despite the fact that, biologically speaking, gender is more complex than conventional dualities imply. Indeed, some societies do find room for third or in-between genders. Modern scholarship on gender is sensitive to these complexities and careful to distinguish between cultural and biological aspects of gender. This means that gender is generally understood to be a culturally constructed system of differences based on physical, morphological, and anatomical differences between the sexes, what are often called biological differences. Gender differences imply more than difference. In all societies that have left records, gender dualities have been interpreted as hierarchies, social dominance hierarchies, with the male side being interpreted as stronger or more positive. So, as Joan Scott put it in 1986, quote, gender is a a constitutive element of social relationships based on perceived differences between the sexes, and gender is a primary way of signifying relationships of power, end quote. Traditionally, assumptions about gender seemed so fundamental that most historians overlooked them. Most historians were male, they took existing gender roles for granted, and they saw the past through male eyes and male preoccupations. Only since the rise of a women's movement in the 19th century have historians begun to see gender roles more clearly and to take them more seriously. And not until the second wave of feminism of the middle of the 20th century did feminist historians begin to show the extent to which history was in fact male history, or history through male eyes, or male perspectives. But attempts to write a distinctive women's history often fell into the trap of writing it within pre-existing categories, such as those of class or nation. By the 1980s, increasing numbers of historians, particularly in the English-speaking world, began to study both male and female history through the category of gender, because it raised deep questions about how the roles of both women and men have been constructed and negotiated over time. Partly under the pressure of gay rights movements, beginning in the English-speaking world, traditional gender categories began to be questioned at even deeper levels, generating renewed interest in the history of sexuality in general. Just as women's history had begun to explore men's history and then gender history, so too the history of homosexuality turned to the study of heterosexuality and then to sexuality in general, and particularly within queer theory, to forms of sexuality that did not fit comfortably within the already dominant established dichotomies. Such studies showed how gender and sexual categories normalized and abnormalized specific roles and behaviors. A particularly important theme in the emerging historiography of sexuality was the question of whether there were distinctively modern attitudes to gender and sexuality, or whether perhaps the categories themselves were products of modernity. Were these categories constructed by some of the same pressures and processes that lay behind modernity more generally? Increasing interest in how historians constructed the categories they used to understand the past may help explain why historians of gender and sexuality were attracted to the broader historiographical movement often known as the cultural turn. This fundamental shift in perspective moved historians from study of evidence about the past as it actually happened, in the words of Ranke, to study how historians used evidence to construct accounts of the past. That move encouraged the idea that historians can never really study an unmediated past. At best, they can study the images historians and others have constructed of the past. Michel Foucault showed the extent to which those images, and even the language in which they were described, supported and reproduced existing power relations. His insight lent a critical edge to the study of historical discourses, including those of gender and sexuality. It also suggested the extent to which domination depended on collusion from below, an idea developed in the notion of hegemony, another concept that proved attractive to historians of gender and sexuality. Extreme forms of social constructivism ran the risk of depriving historians of any intellectual leverage because they lacked anchors in a real world. But in more modest forms, the cultural turn sensitized historians in many different fields, including gender history, to the cultural filters through which historians view, describe, and explain the past, and to the many ways in which those filters also shape the present. Eventually, the parallel tracks of gender history and world history began to overlap. Like gender history, world history attempted to break from established historiographical categories such as the nation-state. But different historiographical breakouts led in different directions. While gender history worked with the differences, world history looked for connections. And while gender history veered towards cultural history, world history usually stayed closer to the materialist traditions of other historical scholarship. There are nevertheless many natural points of contact between gender history and world history, and they will be emphasized at many points in various volumes of the Cambridge World History. They include studies of early human societies, of marriages across cultural lines, of the construction and convention of national identity, of migration, and of colonialism. Interest in the earliest eras of human history has encouraged both world historians and gender historians to reinterpret social and gender relations in Paleolithic societies. Modern accounts of Paleolithic societies emphasize the role of women as much as, and sometimes more than, the role of males, in Chapter 9. For example, gender and world historians have also found common ground in studies of how gender has shaped national identities and symbols. Was homosexuality compatible with full citizenship, even in relatively liberal societies such as the United States of America? Often not is the answer of historians such as Margaret Kennedy and others as well. Gender roles also shaped migration, but the intersection of gender relations and global power relations have been particularly striking in studies of colonialism, where strongly held notions of gender and the family shaped many of the cultural and legal structures of domination. Both world history and gender history have been forced to question and destabilize established dichotomies of domination and of gender. Research linking these once distinct historiographical traditions has added depth to both fields. It has shown the extent to which world history is itself gendered in context and construction, as well as the global reach of the themes explored by gender history. In Chapter 11, Jack Goody describes the long, complex, and fraught relationship between world history and anthropology, another discipline that has attempted to understand humanity at large scales and has wrestled long and hard with Eurocentrism. Jack Goody has played an active role in the complex relationship between these two disciplines, and he argues that they have much to offer each other. Both world history and anthropology, and the closely related discipline of comparative sociology, aspire to an ecumenical understanding of humanity. But while history favored written sources, anthropology preferred oral sources. For much of the 20th century, these methodological differences drove the two fields apart. This was particularly true after the work of Bronislaw Malinowski and his followers encouraged anthropologies to engage in detailed fieldwork in non-literate societies and to focus on the distinctiveness and specificity of each culture. The broader theoretical perspectives of earlier anthropologists, such as Edward Tyler or James Fraser, were increasingly taken up with a different field, that of comparative sociology. One odd consequence of this division of labor was that many anthropologists continued to study even complex societies such as India and China using the methods and assumptions they applied to small-scale societies. Often that meant ignoring written sources. The result was to preserve 19th century distinctions between a modern West and an archaic East. However, such approaches were undermined in the 20th century by the work of Joseph Needham on Chinese science. Until the 14th century, China was the most technological society on the face of the planet. And as Goody writes, quote, I myself was much struck by the fact that until the Italian Renaissance, as Needham claimed, science was more advanced in the East than in the West. Needham also claimed China's economic weight as well was long underestimated within a Eurocentric world history, despite the discovery that it was the greatest exporter of manufactured products until the end of the 18th century. Though they have long traveled on different trajectories, anthropology and world history have much to offer each other. Anthropology has helped world history find new types of sources beyond the books and records, and also to become less Eurocentric and avoid some traditional assumptions about Western exceptionalism. For example, anthropology can show that democracy as a form of government is not uniquely modern or Western, but that consultative forms of government are ancient and global. It can demonstrate how persuasive were early forms of capitalism. Anthropology can also demonstrate how ancient world history itself is. Quote, Thales may have been the first Phoenician philosopher to leave a written record. He was certainly not the first to try and conceptualize the world in a general, moral, and intellectual framework. The precursors, for example, did that. In fact, Goody argues all societies placed themselves in relation to their neighbors and sometimes others as well. World history, then, is nothing new. All societies had some concept of how they themselves fit into the wider picture. Here, Goody extends the arguments in chapters 2 and 3 about the universality of world history. But of course, modern world history is very different from the world history of earlier cultures. Above all, it is secular in its approach, and, at least in inspiration or aspiration, less firmly anchored in local cultural or religious traditions. Both anthropology and world history have attempted to escape from narrowly ethnocentric perspectives, but while world history tended to focus on complex societies, anthropology focused more on small-scale and simpler societies. Particularly earlier in the 20th century, it therefore tended to question the more Eurocentric narratives of some forms of world history, and also the related narratives of increasing complexity. Eric Wolf's Europe and the People Without History show what can be done by systematically incorporating scholarship on the non-literate world into a global account of modern history. So, despite its limitations, anthropology has been a powerful force nudging world history away from the ethnocentric narratives of the 19th century, or even earlier narratives of civilizational superiority that go back at least to the time of Herodotus. The theme of migration is as central within world history as that of gender relations. In chapter 12, Patrick Manning argues that migration is not merely important, it is a natural, even inevitable theme for world history, because world history is by definition about connections. It discourages the study of communities as discrete units. Instead, world history stresses the permeability of communities and the many differences that encourage migratory flows. World history also encourages historical study at multiple scales, an approach that is particularly appropriate for a theme as universal as migration. And world history works within an exceptionally wide range of sources, from those of archaeology, linguistics, and genetics to the more conventional written evidence of books and documents. All are powerful tools for understanding the history of migration. Finally, it is not just people that migrate, but also other species, as well as ideas, religions, diseases, and technologies, so that the study of migration touches on many subfields of world history. While many species migrate, most human migrations are cross-community migrations, taking people, generally young people, from one already existing human community to another. The earliest human migrations were probably driven by environmental changes and by social evolution. Paleolithic migrations took our ancestors around the world, into environments where their technologies changed and even eventually their body types and skin colors. But even in the Paleolithic, most migrations were not into unoccupied regions, but from one community to another. Agriculturalists migrated in new ways and with different motivations and purposes. Their communities were also larger, which means that scholars can use genetic evidence with increasing precision to track migrations. Horse-based societies in Eurasia engaged in new long-distance migrations as well as new types of annual migrations. Larger networks created new types of communities, including linguistic, religious, and eventually national communities, and often people migrated within the containers provided by these networks. The great migratory movements of Austronesian or Bantu speakers are a reminder of how shared language and culture could reshape migratory patterns. Cities also encouraged migrations from villages or small towns in search of work or opportunity. And trade networks by land and sea encouraged the evolution and spread of diaspora communities. The first global migrations began from the end of the 15th century. Some modern migrations, such as the slave trade, were coercive. Again, think about the Atlantic slave trade as part of the Columbian Exchange. But most were voluntary, even if driven by economic pressures. In the 19th century, steamships and railways encouraged larger numbers to migrate faster and further than ever before. Where 10 million had crossed the Atlantic as slaves from 1550 to 1850, so that's about 10 million people crossing the Atlantic in a 300-year period. Nearly 50 million Europeans crossed the Atlantic from 1840 to 1890. Again, that's 50 million, all right, compared to 10 million only in a century. And another 80 million migrants moved from India and China. Two regions of sparse population, North America and Southeast Asia, each absorbed over 30 million immigrants. These migrations created entirely new communities and diasporas, and increased the salience of racial and ethnic identities within large communities. Many modern migrants were peasants heading to cities in their own or other countries, so it is hardly surprising that by the early 21st century, most humans lived in urban areas. But despite these distinctively modern patterns, we still see ancient patterns of migration. Today's cross-community educational migrations are a reminder of the importance throughout human history of migrations by the young away from their home community. Next, in our reading, we will continue our introduction and overview by David Christian for Volume 1 of the Cambridge World History, introducing world history to 10,000 BCE. The next part of the introduction and overview will be part 2, and part 2 will cover the Paleolithic and the beginnings of human history.